Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Natural Stone Institute, for sponsoring our talk today. The Natural Stone Institute represents every aspect of the natural stone industry, offering technical and training resources, professional development, regulatory advocacy, and networking events. Two prominent publications, the Dimension Stone Design Manual and Building Stone Magazine, raise awareness in the design community for best practices and uses of natural stone. It operates an industry accreditation program and two prestigious awards programs, as well as a CEUs for architects and designers. Now I'm excited to introduce our speaker. Tori Kjer, RLA, is the Executive Director at the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, a nonprofit park equity and advocacy organization. She holds a master's degree in landscape architecture from CSU Pomona and is a registered landscape architect. Tori has a passion for community-based creative placemaking and is directly leading efforts to design, develop, and implement innovative ways to strategically integrate multi-benefit greening projects throughout the county system of urban parks and trails. Today, Tori will be presenting her talk on Parks for People, Stories of Park Design and Landscape Architecture Advocacy from Los Angeles. Welcome, Tori.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today and in this virtual space. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share today just a couple stories from my experience working as a landscape architect and park advocate in Los Angeles. My goal is to share some examples of what it's like, highlight the importance of equity-focused work, and as well as deep engagement as part of the planning, design, and construction process. Before I get started, I'm just going to share a quick overview of my organization, the LA Neighborhood Land Trust, and get to know you all a little better. I know this is a little bit different because we're all virtual. I don't know if you all can just use the hand raise function just to share, answer a couple of questions. So I'd love to see if anyone is from Los Angeles or has worked in Los Angeles. Carlos, great. Looks like a couple, wow, lots of folks. Okay, wonderful. So some of the communities I'll be talking about may be familiar to you. Another question I have is, who has led a community planning process? Has anyone led or participated in one as part of your work and your studies? Looks like N has. Anyone else? Okay. I guess the last question I have, has anyone here worked on a park design project? Doesn't look like it. I guess last question, or a couple of folks, has anyone, is anyone interested in going into kind of nonprofit park design or community-based design? Looks like we have a few folks, a couple of you. Okay, wonderful. Well, if you could move to the next slide, please. Great. So really quickly, the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, actually last question. Who has heard of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust? Anyone? Anyone? Alejandra, two people. Jeff, okay, wonderful. So we are a nonprofit community land trust, which means we actually hold property, we own property, and we operate parks and gardens. We were founded in 2002 by former council member Garcetti, who's now our mayor, and a number of other elected officials. And we were really formed to address significant issues related to park equity here in Los Angeles. Community members, activists, landscape architects, a number of folks across the board were saying that basically park access wasn't distributed equally. So people kind of in more white, more affluent communities had greater access to parks, and low-income communities of color had significantly less access to parks. So we were formed to help address these park inequities. In the 20 years since we were formed, we have helped to develop 29 parks and gardens, bringing about 13 acres of open space to the city, getting almost 500,000 Angelinos within a 10-minute walk of a park. Next slide. So as we were formed to address these inequities, our mission is really closely aligned to that. And we believe that parks and gardens are a basic right, that they're just as important as streets and sidewalks and access to transportation and healthy food and having homes. We all need access to parks. They are a critical part of the urban infrastructure, and that kind of for far too long, they're kind of looked at as kind of this kind of nice to have amenity, but not a critical amenity. And we are working to change that dialogue. Next slide. So the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, our key activities that we kind of undertake as part of this process is really kind of everything it takes to design and build a park. But we are very much centered around community and kind of the idea of really building community leaders, organizing community residents to advocate for priorities in their community. So through that lens, we plan, build, operate, and also maintain parks and gardens. So we have built 29 parks, we maintain 13 parks and gardens. Next slide. So this is just a quick kind of overview of our community development model. And when I get into kind of the deeper into my talk, this model is really kind of an overview, I think, of how, kind of best practices around participatory engagement should take place. So engagement and organizing are the first things that happen out of the gate. We don't do anything else until we actually talk to people and work with people. And so as we think about building parks and really anything else in the urban landscape, that engagement, we believe, should be front and center for any project. And we know that it's becoming more common in the world of landscape architecture and planning, but again, we just want to make sure that the community really becomes kind of at the center of the conversation and helps to make decisions that ultimately kind of impact their community. Next slide. So just a couple quick kind of ground rules we feel are important as we think about engaging the community. So we start where the community is. People may not have ever gone through a park planning process, but that's okay. It's not rocket science. It's actually pretty simple. And so our job is to kind of help bring them along and share the process and make sure that they understand kind of the different steps. We do this, we start where they're at by making it easy for them to attend meetings. We make sure that translation is available, materials are in their language, we provide food, childcare. We treat this as a partnership. This is not us, the experts, coming in, but this is really us kind of working in close collaboration and partnership with community residents who ultimately, we believe, knows kind of what they need most. And so that really is kind of a very simple kind of principle that we use as we're going through this process. We will ask the community and find out what their vision is, what type of amenities they want, if it's a park or a garden, different types of programming. We'll plan different ways that the community can get engaged in a process, everything from work days to thinking about how to incorporate art, making sure that the community can participate in hard hat tours. And I think most importantly, we keep showing up. So this is not an easy process. Sometimes it can get hard. People have feelings. They have maybe gone through planning processes that have been very poorly implemented in the past. And so we are here to kind of take the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, and really work through it. And I think that that's important. So I have just like a couple of quick slides right now I'm going to show that's a quick example of a hard kind of time that we had with the planning process. So next slide. So this is the El Sereno Arroyo Playground. If you know Los Angeles, you'll know El Sereno is in Northeast Los Angeles, near Boyle Heights, East LA. And there was a freeway plan to go through the neighborhood. And this property with this park concept you see here actually was on that freeway right of way. So it had been vacant for 60 years. We went through a whole planning process with the community, got pretty much all the way to the end. And then we were ready to name the park. And that's where things went drastically wrong. So next slide. We had opened up the naming process to the community. We'd had a couple ballot boxes at some events and people had voted on names. And there were politics in the community, and people felt that we were not being honest and transparent, and maybe that we were even stacking the vote. There were a lot of accusations flying. Elected officials were called, the newspaper was contacted, it was a big deal. So what we had to do with this process was stop, hear people's concerns, and then we actually ended up basically putting together a full election process where we made sure that everyone understood what was happening. We hired an election arbiter to actually go through the process, set out election rules, the works. Next slide. And as a result, you can see all of the various names we got. I think we got over 100 different names from the community. My favorite name is the Cheeseburger Park. That was one name that I think probably a younger child had selected. But we went through the process. So again, people were upset, they were angry, they felt kind of confused. And so we took a moment to kind of hear that, and then we reset and we kept working through it. And at the end of the day, we were able to, with the election arbiter, to finalize a name. It's the El Sereno Arroyo Playground is the name of the park, and the community was happy. So it took a little bit. There were some stressful moments. There were some kind of issues within the community, but we worked through it. And I think that is really kind of one of my takeaways from this conversation, is that it's not always easy, but it's still extremely important. Next slide. So this slide is from a May Day parade in Portland, Oregon, a long time ago. This is me getting the plastic handcuffs put on my wrists. The radical cheerleading squad I was a part of had spent weeks creating. We were rehearsing cheers about workers' rights and systems change. We practiced all sorts of stunts, everything from the pony mount to the pyramid. And then when we showed up the day of, we were put at the very front of the protest. And we were excited to be there. We gladly led the way, cheering through the streets of downtown Portland until people started to get arrested. At that moment, we decided, okay, it's time to go. So we left, and as we were leaving, the police decided that we were actually the instigators for the parade, because we had been at the front. And so they arrested 3 of us. The police targeted us for arrest because of our position at the front of the parade. They were sure we were the organizers. And as a result, we spent a night in jail, and eventually the charges were dropped. It was a memorable experience, and I'm proud today to say that I have been arrested. I have been dedicated since this time to work towards change. And now with a family and a full-time job, I have less flexibility and time to practice cheers or get arrested. So I found other ways to work towards change while doing something I love, and that's landscape architecture. Next slide. It wasn't a straight path from cheering in the streets of Portland to attending graduate school for landscape architecture at Cal Poly. Here's a view of the San Gabriel Mountains here in Los Angeles. And at Cal Poly, I learned how to write and draw like a landscape architect, make models, think about watersheds. From there, I worked at firms and learned how to develop construction documents and create irrigation plans. And now I'm here at the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, which is really where I wanted to end up. And here my work is to support the team as we advocate for equitable access to open space and design and build parks in some of the most park-poor communities in Los Angeles County. We do this work in partnership with many other nonprofit organizations, elected officials, public agencies, and most importantly, the community. So I moved from Portland, Oregon to the city and county of LA. This was almost 20 years ago. And despite this urban intensity you experience in Los Angeles, those of you who have been here, you know, nature is still around us. We are bordered by 3 mountain ranges. We have the Pacific Ocean, and we have some of the largest regional parks in the country. So you can see the San Gabriel Mountains, which are incredible. Next slide. So from LA River revitalization to the fast expanding transportation system, there's a lot of important work happening here. The San Gabriel Mountains include a national monument. Some park advocates are talking about dusting off the Olmsted plans from the 1930s to find a way to actually wrap our region in parks and green spaces. But LA is huge and resources are so limited. And despite all this energy going into big projects, many communities still struggle to pay for the simplest neighborhood improvements. And a majority of LA County residents still don't have a park within a 10-minute walk of where they live. These are the same residents that are most impacted by rising temperatures, poor air quality, and an increasingly unaffordable cost of living. Next slide. So as we think about park equity and access, I just want to kind of set the stage. And these are things I'm sure many of you already know, but they provide important context. And I think most importantly, based, as you can see in this slide, your zip code determines your life expectancy. So you can see kind of the range of kind of the darker colors are kind of lower life expectancies, and the lighter colors are longer life expectancies. Next slide. So here we can see the life expectancy between Watts and Beverly Hills is over 10 years. And so this is, as the crow flies, about 10 miles and a 10-year life expectancy difference. So your life expectancy and your, determined by your zip code will also, is based on if you have healthcare, access to healthy food, good schools, you can walk or bike safely, cross the street without fear of gang lines, tree canopy, air quality, all of it. And where you live often determines the quality of representation you have from your elected officials, what type of planning and projects that take place in your community. So we're really working to change this. We think it's really, again, this is a significant equity issue. Next slide. So as we look at Los Angeles and many cities around the country, your zip code also determines your access to green space. So here in LA County, just over 50% of residents don't have a park within a 10-minute walk of where they live. And this is important because, again, we know that parks are more than just nice to have amenities. And you can see central Los Angeles, the more urban communities are the dark red, which means they have very high park need. Orange is high need, and then we go into yellow and green, which is moderate, low, and very low. So the communities that I'm talking about today are really in the center. They're the red and the orange. They're the high and the very high need. And again, they're low-income communities of color. And so if we think about park equity, there's significant disparities within communities throughout Los Angeles. Next slide. Just to kind of bring this home, we just know parks are particularly important for the health of children. And as in the pandemic, we have seen this especially. I think that the pandemic has really kind of emphasized this need for parks, and that if children don't have yards, which many of children in Los Angeles don't have, then park really becomes their only access to nature, their only place to play, to meet friends, to develop, to build confidence. And so again, access to parks are really critical for the development of our youth and really kind of the health of our communities. And I know I'm talking about this a lot because I just want to make sure that it's really clear that we have taken kind of park access for granted for so long, and now it's time to really work to reverse the inequities. Next slide. So basically we know parks get kids moving outside, and that we know that access to parks is predictive of higher levels of physical activity. Kids who spend more time outdoors are less likely to be overweight, and exposure to nature can reduce children's stress levels by as much as 28%. A 20-minute walk in nature can help kids with ADHD concentrate. So these are all just really, really important facts. Next slide. So as we think about parks as kind of shared backyards of crowded neighborhoods, this is Maywood, California, that has 40,000 people. It's the densest city west of the Mississippi. This is a park site that we worked on where children actually came into the site and turned it into a BMX park and really their own backyard. Kids need a place where they can exercise and play after school and really build those relationships. Next slide. So this is the after picture of that park. This is Benito Juarez Park in Maywood again. We were able to build kind of an interactive sculptured alebrije play dragon, and again, transform a vacant lot into a usable play space. And access to parks, I would say, kind of isn't just the most important thing. There could be a patch of grass and some trees, and some people may consider that a park. We don't. We really believe that access to high quality parks is important. So what does the park look like? How is it actually meeting the needs of communities where they are located? How is the park maintained? And is the park actually located in a place that people can get to it? Do people have to walk under a freeway underpass to get to it? That if they do, they're probably not going to go. So again, it's not just the existence of parks, it's kind of what's in it, how the community feels about it, do they feel safe? All of these things matter. And park advocates, like the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, we use a range of techniques to make sure that people who need parks most have access to safe, clean, and usable spaces. And it's really a straightforward process, but in some ways it's also complicated because as I mentioned in the kind of the voting for the park name, the design in some ways is very straightforward, but there's a lot of other community dynamics that come in that we actually need to pay attention to and tend to, and we can't just skate over them. So themes of partnership and advocacy are ultimately key to the entire process of park planning. Policy, planning, and design are all conducted with partners, public agencies, everybody from housing advocates to other community-based organizations that are providing nutrition and food access services in communities. As we think about designing parks, we really need to think about the whole community. And we want to make sure that, again, we are laser focused on equity and that the community engagement process that we design and develop is flexible and creative and meets the community where they're at. Next slide. So today I'm going to share stories from our work in Los Angeles, and they are slightly different perspectives, two different projects I'm going to talk about, but they provide insight into our collaboration and communities and the partners and just the ways that we organize to successfully implement projects. Most of our projects are actually started from scratch, and they often begin with just a vacant lot and a motivated community member. So we're going to head to Watts now. You can see this blue circle. This is the site that I'm going to be talking about for our Watts Serenity Park. But as you look at this aerial view of Watts, what you see is a lot of houses, a lot of concrete. You can see a freeway here, a train track here, all this infrastructure. This green here is actually a housing project. It is not a park. There are no parks within walking distance of this community. So again, we're starting here with a vacant lot, a motivated community member. And what we're going to talk about is the transformation of this triangle-shaped lot to a 1 acre park that is ultimately kind of bridging politics, gang politics, community politics. There's 2 housing projects. There's a lot of other dynamics in this community, and they haven't seen a new park ever, never. Okay, next slide. So in Watts, within a 10-minute walk from just about any home, this is what you'll see. You'll find freeways, liquor stores, train tracks, paved and weedy vacant lots. You'll find houses, a lot of them in this really dense community. There's lots of bright concrete streets that reflect heat, sidewalks, and while you're much less likely to find a shade-producing tree, you're gonna also find a lot of kind of this, a lot of just kind of the vacant, the rusted, the kind of the neglected. And this is, you can go to the next slide. This is the neighborhood that Ronald Antwine grew up in, where he first learned how to build parks. Ronald was known to his neighbors as Cartoon, has lived across the street from that triangular shaped lot I showed you. And it was at 114th and Monitor Streets here in Watts. I met him in 2009 when we were starting to partner with the city to purchase that 1 acre lot from the developer who owned the land. We wanted to turn it into a new park. What I didn't know when we started the process was that Cartoon had already been protesting the planned development of yet more housing. The developer had wanted to put a number of different, I think, a whole apartment complex on that lot. And Cartoon had been circulating petitions, organizing neighbors to protest the development, and hosting informational meetings at a church down the street. He was someone who'd grown up in the neighborhood. He didn't want more housing. He actually wanted a park. So that winter, when we started community outreach, there were multiple gang-related shootings within a half mile of the site. City council office typically would help with engagement. They actually said they weren't going to go out, it wasn't safe. But door-to-door outreach is one of the key ways we let community members know about meetings. So I printed some flyers and headed to Watts early on a weekday morning. Next slide. So I took this flyer and I walked the neighborhood hanging flyers on people's fences, on their doors when I could get in to their yards. And after about an hour of walking the streets, I had finished flyering and I got a call on my cell phone, which was on the flyer. And it was Cartoon. We had never met. And at first he was basically like, who are you? What are you doing in my neighborhood? Why are you here? And I explained that I worked for an organization that helps to build parks in communities like Watts, and we were hoping to build one on that lot. And Cartoon said, a park? Really? You want to build a park on that lot, not houses? He said, okay, if anyone gives you any problems, you tell them you are working with Cartoon. And from that day on, I've had Cartoon's number in my phone and have had, really worked with him closely throughout the whole process. Next slide. So we started the planning process, and you can see the banner here on the vacant site. And really building a park from scratch, like we did here, without any identified funding. We didn't have a site, we didn't have a base of support. It's a little bit like magic. You start with nothing and you somehow end up with a park. You begin by identifying partners, then you host workshops, gather surveys, and ask people through the community throughout the community process, what features they would like to see in the new park. The first and most essential step that we take is really identifying priorities and concerns. And this helps us identify what the new park might look like. Next slide. So for Watts, we hosted the workshops at the historic Macedonia Baptist Church. It was about a block from the park and a comfortable gathering place for all community members, easy for them to get to. And we came to our first meeting with large drawings of the vacant lot, boxes of markers and supplies. We also brought food and childcare. We had tamales, fried chicken. We had someone there to help take care of their children, the residents' children, and also translation again. We started by setting expectations about the process and the timeline and explaining that it might be as many as 5 years before the park was constructed, and it was about 4 years actually. First, we would need to convince the property owner to sell the land. And we didn't have funding yet. So then we would need to basically take all of these community priorities and put them into a concept design and then write a grant application to a very competitive program at California State Parks. Once we finally had funding, we explained, then we could get the design permits and start construction. Next slide. So after we set those expectations, we pulled out markers and paper and broke into small groups and started to get ideas for the new park. Meetings followed in the evening or on weekends, and Cartoon and his neighbors had plenty of ideas, which they diagrammed on sheets of paper, just like what you can see here. There were a lot of very serious conversations about what type of activities the park should support. Soccer, basketball, skateboarding, toddler play on a new playground. Residents were very concerned about designing a park that would make sure that it welcomed children and young people without becoming a focus of gang activity. Next slide. So this slide shows the final concept that we sent to state parks. And again, it was developed really as a result of the community priorities. So people asked for a perimeter walking path. You can see that here. They asked for separate picnic areas. So we have 3 here so that individual families can have picnics and as their own group. They asked for a large playground, which you can see here. They asked for a skate area. We put it here, but you'll see it in the final design next. We actually included it on the northern side of the park. And then they asked for just a lot of trees and green, which they don't actually have a lot of in Watts. We also, a goal was to really capture the Watts identity and reflect the personality of the neighborhood. So we were able to incorporate sculptures from an artist in residence at the Watts Towers, as well as incorporate other sustainable design elements like native and drought tolerant plants, stormwater capture, LED lighting, and just lots and lots of green space. So we have a few slides here to show of the park. So here's the completed project. So you can see an aerial view. This is actually the day of the ribbon cutting. So the trees are very small. They've since grown in. It's been open for 5 years at this point. But you can see kind of the large playground, the skate area, perimeter walking path. There's the art sculptures are here in the northern part of the site, and then the picnic areas. Next slide. Here's just a few images of the playground. Next. So we were able to, here you go. So you can see kind of some of the grade change, the elevation changes. We incorporated a train theme. That was a request from the community because the property was excess railroad right of way. We created this grade change to help increase opportunities for physical activity. Kids have to climb up and then they can run down. Next slide. The skate area, next. A picture of kids climbing on the bridge, next. Next, you can just see this is some of mosaic art that we were able to incorporate with an artist from the Watts Towers, next. You can keep going. Okay, great. And then these are the flower sculptures by Charles Dixon, who's an amazing sculptor based here in Los Angeles. Next, and I think this is the final slide. Okay. All right, so the opening of Watts Serenity Park took place on January 24th, 2015. It was a victory for Cartoon, featured here, and his neighbors who had organized against housing and for a park. It was a victory for the community members who participated in the design workshops and then waited very patiently for their ideas to become a reality. Next slide. In addition to the advocacy, there were many other ingredients for building parks like the one in Watts. And so I think that there's a lot of lessons learned from this project. And I think kind of, if I'm sharing kind of some of those lessons learned today, I would say some of the kind of, I think, lessons learned that worked well was making sure that the site location for the park was appropriate, that we brought in enough funding to actually build a beautiful, amazing park that had all of the amenities that the community wanted. And that we were able to find someone to actually own and operate and maintain the park. And that, in this case, was the City of Los Angeles Department of Recreation and Parks. But we were also able to really leverage, I think ultimately, and probably the most important piece of this is community support. And so dedicated neighbors like Cartoon ultimately helped to plan the park and really ensure that it meets the neighborhood needs and that ultimately the residents are caretakers for their park. And, you know, the name of the park, even Watts Serenity Park, was a community selection. So again, we held a voting process and the community ultimately identified the name that they wanted. And I think that Cartoon really became, again, the eyes and the ears. He lived across the street from the park, and he would call me if something like during construction, skateboarders broke into the park because the skate park was just about ready. And Cartoon called me to tell me on a Sunday afternoon. So those eyes and ears are really important as we think about designing and building successful parks. Next slide. So I'm going to transition. This is my last project. I have about, I think, 10 more minutes, and then we'll wrap up for questions. This is a slightly different type of project that is focused on using leftover spaces. And this is something that we do a lot here in Los Angeles. It's extremely dense. And so public rights of ways like alleys, transmission corridors, even the LA River are important to helping to make sure that we can, again, increase access to open space. And so it doesn't always have to be a traditional park project. We're really thinking about how can we increase access to nature and communities. And so what you see here is that, again, there's inequitable distribution of open space. So if you look at parks versus alleys, you can see kind of alleys throughout Los Angeles. There's 900 linear miles. South LA has 2/3 of the alleys in Los Angeles, but they're mostly kind of full of trash, unpaved, not accessible. But if we think about kind of increasing access to open space using these right-of-ways, we can see alleys become an interesting opportunity. And so let's see, alleys become, I think, you know, an opportunity to think about climate resilience as we look at bringing in more trees. If we bring in stormwater capture elements into the alleys, they can become multi-benefit projects. and ultimately helping to kind of bring in significant benefits for urban communities. Next slide. So this is a picture of one of the Avalon Green alleys before. And it was my first collaboration with the city of Los Angeles to renovate a network of alleys in South LA. And this was a new idea for the city. No one in the city had really thought about taking alleys and turning them into multi-benefit community spaces. But there was a lot of opportunity here. We figured out that basically these alleys had the kind of ability to infiltrate the equivalent of 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools of rainwater each year. South LA is very porous, and so the groundwater table is just about 100 feet below the surface. Next slide. The Avalon neighborhood, as I mentioned, is a great place for stormwater infiltration. It's also extremely dense. There's 50,000 people living within a 10-minute walk of the alley network, so it made a great location for a demonstration project. And just a quick note on this, we were looking at the alleys as an opportunity to increase access to nature. The city and our city partners that were in support of the project were looking at this as an opportunity to capture stormwater. And so we went with that. And you can see this is an article from the New York Times just talking about the stormwater benefits. And we agree those are important, but there's so many other benefits, again, of taking some of those public rights of way and turning them into usable open space. Next slide. So the Avalon Green Alley Network encompasses 8 alleys, and in total, they're about 1 mile in length. And the alley renovations included stormwater BMPs, resurfacing the alleys with permeable pavement. The streets and the alleys in the network were also planted with new street trees, art elements, lights, really helping to make them become kind of beautiful spaces for the community. And so you can see kind of the yellow and the orange alleys on this plan. The orange alleys were the tier 1 alleys that had a complete renovation, and then the yellow alleys had art and other elements added. But the stormwater improvements were just on these 2 alleys. We were able to close off about a 100-foot stretch of this alley so that it became more of an actual gathering space. So meaningful community engagement involves early planning before the project is designed. Next slide. And so residents of communities, just like the one that surround the Avalon Green Alley Network, will frequently attend meetings, but if they don't see a benefit to themselves, just like I'm sure you're probably not going to attend the meetings. So what we needed to do was to really make these activities and the project relevant to the community. So when we began our effort, we held our first meeting in a backyard near the alleys. There was no community meeting space. There was actually no school. There was no safe place. So we met in someone's backyard. And I feel like that's a really great kind of example of creativity when you're thinking about engagement, is setting up meetings on the street or kind of any place you can. In this case, it was someone's backyard. So we began our effort by holding that meeting in a backyard near the alleys, and neighbors came reluctantly. Many neighbors didn't really care about the alleys, honestly. It was mostly moms, and they were busy. They didn't see a clear connection between what we were proposing and the safety and garbage and dumping issues plaguing the neighborhood. To them, alleys, stormwater, and greening just weren't a top priority. So we had to start to build trust through steady engagement and meeting them where they were at. Next slide. Similar to the Watts project, we organized outreach for meetings that were convenient for the neighbors. We held meetings in the community room of a local high school during the day when children were at school. We sent reminder flyers and calls were made, and we provided snacks and childcare and coffee and whatever it took to get people there. We focused our discussion topics on the meeting on important issues like the condition of local streets, garbage, and safety. And we invited the local police to come and attend and hear the concerns. Eventually, the meetings gained traction, and we held poetry workshops, mural planning and painting, and planted street trees. And for the Avalon Alley Network, the community priorities weren't necessarily in alignment with what the cities were. So the city wanted the stormwater capture. They wanted the benefits of keeping water kind of in the basin. The community wanted clean and green and safe. And so our job was to kind of merge those priorities together and come up with a project that ultimately benefited the community. So we started with a project actually let's see. Can you go to the next slide, please, Eileen? I think I may have jumped. Okay, actually go 2 slides back for me, sorry. So we started with basically with the community. I just want to have a picture. This is the green team. So we started, the moms gave themselves a name. They called themselves the Equipo Verde, which is green team. We made t-shirts. We started to plan and implement activities like alley cleanups, tree plantings. You can see like vine planting on the sides of the alley to eliminate graffiti and help to kind of beautify some of these kind of fences that were in really poor condition. The moms kept meeting, and actually they're still meeting today. So this is almost a decade later. Moms from the Equipo Verde they're the heart and soul of this alley network. This group of more than 30 moms and occasional dads, sometimes there's one dad, they still meet once a month. They discuss topics including neighborhood safety, cleanups, who was going to care for the trees they planted. They became much more than just kind of a community group planning an open space. They actually started to really unify around their neighborhood. Next slide. So through the steady community building process, the Avalon community is creating connections. They're creating connections to nature and creating places where residents can walk, exercise, play, and socialize. And so again, this is so much more than just the project. This is about building community support, buy-in, and ultimately leadership within communities. Next slide. A few weeks ago, I spent an evening in a small city at the edge of the county of Los Angeles. It had clear views of the San Gabriel Mountains, just like you can see here. And the San Gabriels, they are a mountain range that is still rising. They contain some of the steepest and wildest slopes in the United States. Yet many Los Angeles County residents have never visited these mountains or other mountains and beaches that surround our city. So many families in Los Angeles County, while completely surrounded nature, have never experienced it firsthand. Next slide. How will our children know and appreciate the connection between nature and human well-being if they haven't experienced nature for themselves? These same children are the voters, policymakers, and landscape architects of tomorrow. Next slide. As landscape architects, activists, and advocates, we have the responsibility to carefully and strategically build social cohesion through the design and planning of the built environment. Our role is to sow the seeds of a resilient future in those communities that need it most. Not just climate resilience, but also community resilience that is created as a result of the conversations, engagement with local leaders, and understanding of public process. This is a resiliency that comes when neighbors in Watts advocate for a park at the end of their block and then help design their park and proudly cut the ribbon. Or when neighbors in the Avalon community of South Central talk to each other for the first time ever, walk their streets and alleys, take an inventory of street trees, sweep and weed, and participate in the cleaning and greening of their community. And in the process to get to know, to learn, to support each other. Next slide. My work as a landscape architect is building parks and green infrastructure projects in urban Los Angeles. It's a long ways from my activist days cheerleading at protests in Portland, but there are many similarities. Just like it requires coordination, strategy, trust, and ground up action to build a human pyramid, it requires coordination, strategy, trust, and ground up action to build a park. Next slide. Activism and advocacy require many of the same skills. Systematic change requires deep collaboration, patience, planning, flexibility, and problem solving. It requires creativity, enthusiasm, and risk. It requires being at the front of the parade, even if it means getting arrested. Next slide. Thank you. And that is it for my talk.
Thank you so much for the incredible talk, and now we'll start taking questions from the Zoom Q&A feature. So our first question is from Jeff West, and Jeff is wondering, what are some of the volunteer activities available with the Land Trust?
That's a great question, Jeff, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation offline as well if you live here in Los Angeles. But, we frequently have interns or volunteers help with engagement. Sometimes we have, since we operate and manage parks and gardens, We frequently have volunteer days at Parks and Gardens where we mulch and we kind of tidy things up, and kind of anything kind of related to that. We're a small team. We're only, there's 5 full-time staff and then 9 part-time staff. So we can always use the help.
Our next question is, can you please tell us more about fundraising? Do you have any other recommendations outside of grants? Do you have any recommendations for individuals or community groups who want to create parks in areas outside of LA but don't know where to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here in California, we have a good amount of public funding that helps to support the development of parks and other urban greening projects like the alleys that I shared. I think a good place to start is always to check with your local city, because sometimes they'll have little pockets of money. And the El Sereno Arroyo Playground, the project I shared at the beginning, with all the challenges around the naming, that project was actually developed in close partnership with the city, where we only had to raise about $400,000. And then the city actually used its own kind of maintenance team to install irrigation and help with some of the like grading activities. So there may be opportunities for kind of creative partnerships with cities. And also, in addition to public funding, sometimes foundations will have grants. It really kind of depends on where you live and kind of what some of the kind of opportunities are in the community. There's also federal grants, especially now with the change of administration. There's actually been more funding released for parks and open spaces. So I know that's kind of a vague answer. I think it really depends on where you're at, but I think starting by talking with your local city, not just the Parks Department, but also maybe the mayor's office, your council member, or whoever your local elected is, have multiple conversations. And I would say, don't take no for an answer. So sometimes, these projects take a long time, and I think kind of being tenacious, holding on, is a really important part of the process. Oh, I think you're on.
I was muted, yeah. Are homeless individuals also included in the community engagement process? And how do you recommend reaching out to them and getting them involved in the design process?
That's a great question. And here in Los Angeles, unfortunately, we have just a huge crisis for many people. Many people are unhoused, and parks do become kind of that safety net. So there isn't really kind of like one specific answer for this question. I think it depends on the community. Again, it depends on the issues. For many communities, kind of addressing issues related to kind of unhoused communities and incorporating them in the process can be tricky, because a lot of times kind of unhoused individuals don't necessarily trust kind of groups, even like ours, that are coming in. There's also issues like addiction issues and mental health issues. And so there's kind of a wide range of issues. I think from my experience, one of the best ways to kind of manage that engagement and also just make sure that you're, again, building a park for everyone, is to really coordinate closely with your local city or your council member and kind of think about those issues, those opportunities. And I think we actually had a park we were building in a community in Hollywood that had, there were 3 homeless youth shelters within a half mile of the site. And while we were doing the design for the park, we actually had a number of residents. They actually started a petition against the park. And we had a protest against the park, where people showed up with signs that said parks equal homelessness and parks equal gangs. And so it was really felt like an episode out of Parks and Recreation, if you guys have seen that show. But at the end of the day, what we did is we basically just kind of stuck with it. And, our message was, these parks are for everyone. And if the homeless youth need a place to go in the community during the day, that's okay. This park is for them. And so a lot of it was just about education, kind of having discussions and just raising awareness about kind of the role that parks actually serve everyone, and they're not just for kind of a few privileged people in the community. After the park was completed, it was opened. We haven't had any issues. It's been used by everyone and it's been fine. So I think there's a good amount of education, conversation with everyone. And then again, bringing in your electeds, bringing in the policymakers and the leadership of the city to make sure that kind of that conversation takes place kind of across the board.
Our next question is from Juwan, and Juwan wants to know, what does it take to establish and grow a land trust? How important are land trusts for equitable design?
That's a great question. So land trusts are one model for kind of ensuring access to parks and open space. And in recent years, there's many housing land trusts that have formed to help kind of purchase properties, maybe old apartment buildings, ensure that they stay in community ownership and don't get flipped and kind of used for the profit of a developer. And parkland trusts are similar. Our job is to ultimately hold property and ensure that it stays kind of for the benefit of community residents. I think as someone who operates a land trust, I see incredible value in them. And I feel that, you know, one of the things that we're able to do for the parks and gardens we operate is we actually hire community residents to help with the operations. So community residents open and close the parks and gardens. They do some of the maintenance for about 10 hours a week. And they are the eyes and ears. And our parks are immaculate because of that kind of community ownership. So I think as a land trust, we have a lot more flexibility in how we operate, the amenities we include, and some of the other kind of things that we do, like programming. But land trusts aren't the only way entity that is also involved in designing and building parks. And so other community groups and advocates are equally important in the conversation. It really takes everyone. It's especially here in Los Angeles, such a large county. We have, you know, we're more populous LA County is than 42 states in the nation. So we are huge, and park inequities there's so much. We really need cities, land trusts, other advocates all helping to pull together and design and build parks. But land trusts are definitely a tool. There's a great toolkit out of the University of Minnesota. I think if you Google land trust, University of Minnesota, I think it should come up. And it kind of walks through the role of different types of land trusts. It's a great kind of way to kind of get more exposure and understanding of land trusts.
Our next question is, for landscape architecture students who want to move into nonprofit work as opposed to a traditional design practice, what advice can you give? Are there any courses, experiences, internship experiences, etc., that would help prepare students?
That's a great question. And when I went back to get my master's, I actually knew that this is where I wanted to end up, was working in the nonprofit sector, doing advocacy, planning, and design. After I graduated with my master's, I actually went and worked at firms, designing and building projects for 3 years. And that helped me understand kind of the design process, the construction process. And I think those skills help me now as I lead an organization. We have an 8.5 acre park, $50 million park that's under construction right now. Someone else on the team is managing it, but these skills are very helpful. So I would say consider going and kind of into a firm and getting that experience and that exposure. And then in terms of getting your foot in the door, I think volunteering, having an internship is also a great way to get that experience. I never had an internship with a nonprofit. I did have an internship with a city. So some of it is also just networking. I volunteered and attended meetings of some of the kind of park equity advocates in Los Angeles to kind of get that exposure and meet people. So I do think networking is helpful as you're looking to make connections. But at the end of the day, I honestly think, again, this isn't rocket science. There's some techniques, but I think also, it's kind of, you just roll up your sleeves and jump in, and you make mistakes and you learn. So the naming process for the El Sereno Arroyo Playground that I shared, oh my gosh, we made so many mistakes on that. But at the end of the day, we stuck with it and it ended up being okay. So I think if you're able to do some networking, meet people that are already doing the work and get an internship, that's great, but I don't think it's a requirement. I can share, I realize I didn't include my email on the presentation. I'd be happy to put it in the chat really quickly in case you're interested in reaching out afterwards. I'll do that at the very end because I can't, I'm horrible at typing and chatting, or typing and talking at the same time.
I think we have time for just one more question. And this last question is, this person says, I appreciate the focus on play and playgrounds as an important type of landscape architecture. With my background coming from the East Coast, have you found any considerations or elements to play or park design that you found specific to LA?
I feel like really the park elements that we've included are probably would work across the country. We don't have the freeze-thaw cycle that other parts of the country have. So there may be, mosaics. I don't know like how some of the art elements would hold up to the freeze-thaw cycle, but I think it's just bringing in experts like a mosaic artist that has done public art in your community, and they can bring that expertise in how to design and plan for kind of those types of conditions. I know like with the fitness equipment, the exercise equipment that's very popular, vendors are familiar with more humidity in Florida, for instance, things may rust a little sooner, but I think vendors understand how to kind of manage for the elements. The one benefit I think we have of being in Los Angeles is, for instance, with the alleys, we were able to have meetings outside in the winter. You probably can't do that on the East Coast. So you may have to kind of adjust your engagement, but I think in terms of design and amenities, they're pretty universal. And you can definitely work with vendors that have experience kind of in these climates to make sure that everything, kind of fits kind of those needs. But I don't, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for an incredible talk. Tori, would you like some time to put your email in the chat before we end?
Yeah, let me do that really quickly. For some reason, oh, here it is. Oops, it's coming up on the side. Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'd say is I do believe that, kind of connections are, when I got my first 3 jobs after grad school, it was really because I had, known somebody who had made a kind of a referral or an introduction. So I'm here and happy to be a resource.
I'll just let everyone have a few moments to copy down her email, and I'd like to thank Tori again for her talk and such an engaging Q&A session, and also thank everyone for attending. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference. And we'll be ending here now to accommodate the rest of the Zoom sessions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone.